Mary Curzon died on a summer afternoon in London, July 18th, 1906. Heart failure. She was 36 years old, and she had not been well for a long time. Her husband George sat beside her as she went. He was one of the most powerful men in the British Empire, a former Viceroy of India, a man who had governed 300 million people, commanded armies, and staged the largest imperial ceremony the world had ever seen. He could not keep his wife alive. Years later, he told friends that he did not fear death. It would let him see Mary again. What made this loss so devastating was not just love. It was debt, not financial debt. George Curzon owed nearly everything he had become to the woman from Chicago who chose him before he chose her. She had financed his career, charmed his voters, hosted his empire, and sacrificed her health on a continent that slowly pulled her apart. He had repaid her with long absences, impossible expectations, and the quiet assumption that her role was to serve his. Mary Leiter was born in 1870 to a father who co-founded what became Marshall Field and Company. She grew up in Washington, D.C., among presidents and ambassadors. She was tall, sharp, and restless. When she met George Curzon at a London ball, she decided on the spot that she would marry him. She was 20. He was 31. He had no idea what was coming. Within a decade, she would stand in a gown of gold inside Delhi's Red Fort, the highest-ranking American woman in the British Empire. Within 2 decades, she would be in the ground. If you find value in stories like this, take a moment to subscribe. It makes a real difference. Chapter 1. Fire in Chicago. Levi Ziegler Leiter arrived in Chicago in 1855 with a talent for numbers and nothing else. He was 21, out of Leitersburg, Maryland, a speck on the map named after his own family. His ancestors had crossed from Switzerland nearly a century before and settled in the hills west of Baltimore. They were not poor, but they were not going anywhere either. Levi wanted to go somewhere. Chicago was barely a city, 20,000 people. Wooden storefronts along dirt roads that flooded in the spring and froze in the winter. But the railroads had begun to arrive, and with them came a particular kind of man. Clerks, speculators, salesmen, all of them betting that this flat, swampy outpost on Lake Michigan would become the commercial center of the continent. Levi took a job as a bookkeeper at Cooley, Wadsworth and Company, the largest dry goods firm in town. Within 5 years, he was a junior partner. So was another young employee named Marshall Field. Field sold, Leiter counted. Field charmed customers and arranged window displays. Leiter tracked inventory, managed suppliers, and squeezed margins until they bled. Neither man was sentimental about the other, but together they built something formidable. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, neither enlisted. They stayed behind their counters and sold goods to the Union Army at wartime prices. By the end of the conflict, both had enough capital to take a risk. In 1865, they went into business with Potter Palmer, a retailer whose health was failing but whose money was very much intact. Palmer funded the initial operation. The store opened as Field, Palmer, Leiter and Company. Within 2 years, Palmer withdrew to focus on real estate. The business became Field and Leiter, and the white marble building on State Street that housed it became known across Chicago as the Marble Palace. 5 years of growth followed. Then, on the night of October 8th, 1871, Chicago burned. The Great Fire consumed more than 17,000 structures over 2 days. Field and Leiter lost $2.5 million in stock. Their building was gone before dawn. But when the flames were still moving through the city, Levi Leiter was already loading wagons. He drove his most valuable merchandise to his own house, well outside the fire's path. It was not enough to save the business. It was enough to restart it. They reopened within weeks in a temporary building by the lakefront. What Leiter did next mattered more than any retail sale he ever made. While half of Chicago's property owners were dumping land at desperate prices, Leiter bought. Block after block, lot after lot, at rates that would not exist again in his lifetime. A second fire destroyed their rebuilt store in 1877. They rebuilt once more. But by then, Leiter's attention had already shifted. The future was not behind a shop counter. It was underneath his feet. In January of 1881, Leiter sold his share of the partnership to Marshall Field for $6 million. Adjusted for today, that figure approaches $200 million. Field renamed the business Marshall, Field and Company and went on to create a retail empire. Leiter took his payout and did something quieter, but, in the end, more profitable. He bought Chicago. Over the next decade, he accumulated downtown properties at a pace that made him one of the largest individual landholders in the city. He commissioned the second Leiter building on State Street, an 8-story steel frame structure that anticipated the modern skyscraper. He took major positions in the Chicago City Railroad, the Illinois Trust and Savings Bank, and the Pullman Palace Car Company. By the mid-1890s, his estate was valued at over $15 million. Adjusted for inflation, that figure reaches somewhere above $500 million. 1 year before the Great Fire, on the 27th of May, 1870, Levi and Mary Teresa Leiter had their second child, a daughter. They named her Mary Victoria. She was born into money that was still being made in a city that did not yet respect the people making it. The Leiters had wealth, but Chicago's older families kept their doors shut. A bookkeeper who had profited from a disaster. A wife whose social events drew more mockery than admiration. 4 children with no lineage to speak of. The drawing rooms along the lake shore would not open for them. Levi did not waste time fighting a losing battle. He looked east instead. Chapter 2. DuPont Circle. The house cost $11,500 a year to rent. In the 1880s, that was the highest price anyone had paid for a residence in the entire capital. The Leiters did not mind people knowing. That was the point. The property had once belonged to James G. Blaine, a former Speaker of the House and perennial presidential candidate. It sat on DuPont Circle, a fashionable address lined with the mansions of senators, diplomats, and industrialists who had come to Washington for the same reason the Leiters had. In this city, money did not need a pedigree. Power could be rented by the season. Mary Teresa Leiter thrived in this environment. Within a few seasons, she had turned the Blaine house into a destination. Her parties grew larger, more elaborate, more talked about. At one gathering, she stretched a silk ribbon across the ballroom and announced that it separated the true social elite from everyone else. The guests on the wrong side of the ribbon were not amused. The newspapers loved it. The family rented the Blaine house for nearly a decade before Levi commissioned something permanent. In 1893, architect Theophilus Chandler completed the Leiter house at 1500 New Hampshire Avenue, 55 rooms, neoclassical facade. A statement in stone that the family had arrived and intended to stay. Through all of this, their eldest daughter was watching. Her brother Joseph was 2 years older, headstrong and reckless in ways that would later cost the family millions. Her sisters, Nancy and Marguerite, known as Daisy, were younger, but she was the one their mother focused on first. Her education was unusual for a girl of her era and class. A French governess taught her the language and the expected feminine graces, dancing, singing, music, art. But her mother went further. She brought in a professor from Columbia University to teach the girl history, arithmetic, and chemistry. These were harder, less decorative subjects, the kind normally reserved for sons. Time at a boarding school in England gave her a polish and a worldliness that most American debutantes lacked. By her late teens, she had become something rare, striking, poised, and genuinely well-read. She counted among her close friends Frances Folsom Cleveland, who had entered the White House at just 21, the youngest First Lady in American history. The two moved in the same circles. She attended state dinners, embassy receptions, and the kind of private gatherings where cabinet members spoke freely. She learned how power worked before she ever left American soil. The family also kept a summer estate at Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Linden Lodge sat on the lakefront, and the Leiters spent their warmest months there. Their eldest daughter earned a nickname in that small, wealthy community that followed her for the rest of her life. They called her the Lake Geneva Princess. It was meant partly as a compliment and partly as a warning. She carried herself with a seriousness that made certain people uncomfortable. Her mother had given her every possible advantage: languages, connections, education, confidence. There was only one thing left to acquire, and it could not be found in Washington or Lake Geneva. Mary Theresa Leiter began planning trips to Europe. Chapter 3. The Hunt for a Title. The first stop was Paris. Mary Theresa had heard that French aristocrats welcomed wealthy Americans, and she arrived with her eldest daughter expecting introductions, invitations, and perhaps a suitable match. What she found instead were drawing rooms full of men who looked at American money the way a cat looks at rain. Polite enough not to hiss, but with no intention of getting wet. The French, mother and daughter agreed, were self-centered and impossible. They turned their attention to England. Getting into London society required a door, and the Leiters found theirs through Sir Lion Playfair, a Scottish chemist turned politician whose third wife, Edith Russell, happened to be from Boston. The Playfairs invited Mary and her mother to a luncheon that included the Prince and Princess of Wales. The Duchess of St Albans handled the formal introduction. From that afternoon forward, the doors did not close. This was 1890, and Mary was not the only American heiress circling London that season. Dozens of wealthy families from New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago were sending their daughters across the Atlantic with the same objective. The British press had already coined a name for them: dollar princesses. The arrangement was straightforward. American families had fortunes but no titles. British aristocrats had titles but crumbling estates and mounting debts. Marriage solved both problems. The brides brought cash. The grooms brought coronets. Everyone pretended it was about love. Mary did not fit the pattern neatly. She was not a reluctant bride being pushed toward a stranger by her mother. When she walked into a ball in London that spring and saw George Nathaniel Curzon standing across the room, she made a decision that had nothing to do with transaction. He was a Conservative Member of Parliament in his early 30s, representing Southport since 1886. The eldest son of Baron Scarsdale, which meant he would eventually inherit Kedleston Hall, a Robert Adam masterpiece in Derbyshire that the family struggled to maintain. But Curzon did not trade on his inheritance. The titles could wait. He had made his name through his own work, travelling extensively through Russia, Central Asia, Persia, and the Far East. He had published serious books on the geopolitics of the region. He was considered one of the sharpest young minds in Westminster, and he carried himself accordingly. His Oxford classmates had written a verse about him that stuck for life. "My name is George Nathaniel Curzon. I am a most superior person." Superior was the right word. He was brilliant, relentless, and coldly aware of his own talent. He was also unmarried and in significant debt. Women had always been drawn to him, and he had not discouraged this. His reputation in certain circles was that of a man who cornered women in corridors, country houses, and railway carriages. He was charming when it served him. He was absent when it did not. None of this deterred Mary. She was 20 years old, nearly 6 feet tall, and had been quietly studying men like him for years. She had been educated beyond what most men of her class could claim. She looked at George Curzon and saw not a risk, but a project. A brilliant, difficult man who needed someone beside him. She reportedly told a friend after that first meeting that she intended to marry him. She believed he needed her. She said she had no shame about it. George noticed her. He admitted later that he had felt an immediate pull. At a country house gathering shortly afterward, they walked through a garden together, and he confessed that he had struggled not to kiss her. But he did not propose. He did not even commit to seeing her again with any regularity. He went back to Westminster, back to his travels, back to his life. Mary went home to Washington and waited. The attraction was real, the commitment was not, and the gap between the two would define the next 5 years of her life. Chapter 4. The Secret Engagement. 2 years passed before they saw each other again. George wrote to Mary. She wrote back. The letters crossed the Atlantic in both directions, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, always on his terms. He set the pace. She followed it. When he was engaged in parliamentary work or planning another expedition to Asia, weeks could pass without a word. Mary filled the silence with patience and, when patience ran thin, with willpower. They met again in Paris in 1892. Whatever doubts George had been carrying seemed to dissolve in that city. The courtship accelerated. They saw each other at dinners, at small receptions, in the kind of brief encounters that Victorian propriety allowed between unmarried people of their class. By the end of that visit, something had shifted. George was no longer circling. He was committed, or at least he said he was. The engagement that followed was unlike anything Mary had imagined. George insisted on absolute secrecy. No announcement, no celebration, no ring on her finger in public. His reasons were partly political and partly personal. He did not want the press to interfere with his plans. He did not want his rivals in Parliament to use an American bride against him. And he did not want to be rushed. There was work to do first. The work, in this case, was a journey to the farthest edges of the British Empire's influence. Between 1893 and 95, George embarked on extended expeditions through Afghanistan and the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia. He was mapping passes, studying Russian troop movements, and gathering intelligence that he believed would shape British foreign policy for a generation. All of it put thousands of miles between himself and the woman he had just promised to marry. Mary was left in Washington with a truth she could share with almost no one. Her mother knew. A handful of close friends may have suspected. But to the rest of the world, Mary Leiter was simply an unmarried heiress in her early 20s, waiting for something that might never arrive. She could not explain why she turned down other suitors. She could not account for the long stretches of silence from England. She could only wait and trust that the man she had chosen would eventually come back and follow through. George did write from the road. His letters arrived from Kabul, from mountain camps, from remote outposts where the mail took weeks to reach civilization. They were affectionate, but always framed by his own concerns. His health, which had never been strong, the pain in his spine that made riding for hours a particular agony, the political calculations that consumed his every waking thought. Mary's replies were steadier, more direct, and quietly unyielding. There were no ultimatums, no pleas. She simply refused to disappear. By the time George returned to England in early 1895, the years since that first meeting in London had blurred together. During that entire stretch, they had spent a total of roughly 2 days in each other's physical presence, plus a handful of scattered hours. Their entire relationship had been built on paper and on faith. Mary knew the man she was marrying primarily through his handwriting. George, for his part, had made his expectations plain. He wanted a wife who understood her place, someone who would support his ambitions without competing with them, someone who would manage his household, charm his constituents, and never ask to be treated as an equal. He once said, in words that have survived because Mary kept the letter, that he wanted a girl who knew a woman's place and did not yearn for trousers. "Give me," he wrote, "Mary." She accepted these terms. Whether she believed she could change them later, or whether she genuinely shared his view of marriage, is impossible to know. What is documented is that she did not hesitate. The engagement became public. The wedding was set for April. Mary Leiter had waited 5 years for this moment. She had kept her promise. The question now was whether George Curzon would keep his. Chapter 5. The Wedding and the New Life. On the 22nd of April, 1895, Mary Leiter married George Curzon at St. John's Episcopal Church on Lafayette Square in Washington. Bishop Talbot officiated. The guest list read like a directory of Anglo-American power. Sir Julian Pauncefote, the British ambassador, sat near the front. Frances Cleveland, whom Mary had known since her teens, attended as First Lady. That morning, 150 guests had gathered at the Leiter House on New Hampshire Avenue for a wedding breakfast that the newspapers described as the finest social event Washington had seen in years. Behind the celebration, money was changing hands. Levi Leiter settled George Curzon's debts, which were considerable. A man who had spent years travelling the world on a parliamentary salary had accumulated obligations that his family estate could not cover. The dowry itself was reported at $200,000, though some accounts placed the total financial transfer significantly higher, possibly reaching several million. The exact figure was never made public. What mattered was the result. George Curzon entered his marriage debt-free, and Levi was not finished. He purchased No. 1 Carlton House Terrace for the couple, the first in a row of 22 columned houses overlooking St. James's Park, with marble pillars and a view across the park toward Buckingham Palace. He paid for it outright. George accepted without hesitation. Everything the young couple owned, from the silver on the table to the roof over their heads, traced back to a retired dry goods merchant from Chicago. The couple's other residence was Kedleston Hall. Mary had heard George speak about it for years, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality. The hall was not a home in any ordinary sense. It was a statement built in the 1760s for a Curzon ancestor who wanted to rival the Duke of Devonshire's Chatsworth. Its central block was designed for display and entertainment. The family actually lived in a side wing. One room alone, the marble hall, could swallow most London drawing rooms whole. And yet the place was cold, draughty in winter, and far from finished in terms of what George believed it deserved. Mary entered a place that demanded constant attention and gave back very little warmth. She adapted. Within months of the wedding, she was campaigning beside George in his Southport constituency. He was standing for re-election that autumn, and Mary proved unexpectedly effective on the trail. She shook hands, attended local events, and charmed voters with a directness that British politicians' wives rarely displayed. Several observers noted afterward that George owed his victory more to his wife's warmth than to his own speeches. In June, Lord Salisbury offered George the position of Under Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. The trajectory was now steep and fast. That same year brought something George wanted even more than political office. On Christmas Eve, 1895, Mary began showing signs of premature labour. The couple feared the worst. A doctor was called urgently to Carlton House Terrace, and he managed to stabilise her condition. Their first child, a daughter named Mary Irene, was born in January 1896. She was healthy. George was relieved. But when Mary looked at her husband holding their newborn girl, she understood something that did not need to be spoken. He loved the child. He had wanted a son. The barony of Scarsdale required a male heir, and this pressure, quiet but unyielding, would follow them into every room and every country they entered together. For now, though, the marriage worked. Mary ran 2 households, entertained George's political allies, and built a social network that bridged Washington and London with a fluency that no purely British wife could have matched. Her father's money kept the machinery running. Her own intelligence kept it pointed in the right direction. Her husband, absorbed in his rising career, accepted all of this as his due. He had told her before the wedding exactly what the terms were. She had agreed. And for these first few years, the arrangement held. But George Curzon was not a man whose aspirations stopped at Under-Secretary. India was next, and India did not care what arrangements a husband and wife had made between them. Chapter 6. Viceroy of India. Their second daughter arrived in August 1898. They named her Cynthia, another girl. George said nothing about it publicly, but the silence carried its own weight. 6 weeks later, he received the appointment he had spent his entire career pursuing. At 39, George Nathaniel Curzon was named Viceroy of India, the youngest man to hold the position in the history of the Raj. He was simultaneously created Baron Curzon of Kedleston in the Peerage of Ireland. Mary, who had been a parliamentary wife for 3 years, was now something else entirely. The family sailed for India before the end of the year. When they stepped off the ship in Bombay, the reception was unlike anything Mary had experienced. Military escorts, gun salutes, thousands of spectators lining the route from the harbour to the train station. George had always believed that imperial power required visible display, that the people of India measured the strength of their rulers by the spectacle they produced. From the moment they arrived, every movement was choreographed, every appearance a performance. Their new residence was Government House in Calcutta, a vast Palladian structure that visitors often found strangely familiar. There was a reason. The building had been constructed in the early 1800s by the Marquis of Wellesley, who had taken Kedleston Hall as his model. Mary had crossed an ocean and half a continent to find herself living in a copy of the house she had left behind in Derbyshire. The irony was not lost on her, but where Kedleston was cold and underused, Government House was alive with protocol, staff, and obligation. Hundreds of servants moved through its corridors at all hours. A private secretary managed the diary. An aide-de-camp handled introductions. Every meal, every reception, every departure through the front gate followed a script that had been refined over decades. Mary's role within this machinery was specific and unrelenting. She hosted state dinners for Indian princes, foreign dignitaries, and senior military officers. Ceremonial functions took her across the country, from Calcutta to Simla, the hill station where the government relocated during the unbearable summer heat. Hours of formal receptions followed, where the order of precedence determined who spoke to whom and in what sequence. None of it was optional. The Vicereine was expected to embody British authority with the same gravity as the Viceroy himself, but without any of his formal power. What set Mary apart was how she filled this role. Most British wives in her position had grown up inside the system. They understood the codes, the silences, the precise weight of a glance across a banquet table. Mary had learned none of this in Washington or Lake Geneva. She brought something different, a warmth that cut through the formality, a willingness to speak directly to people whom the protocol suggested she should merely acknowledge. Indian guests noted the difference. So did the British press, which had been skeptical of an American vicereine and now found little to criticize. She was, by any measure, performing a role that no American woman had occupied before or would occupy again for a very long time. But performance was the correct word. Behind the state dinners and the military escorts, Mary was a woman far from home, managing a household the size of a small government, raising 2 young daughters in a climate that drained Europeans of their strength, and doing all of it in service to a husband who was swallowed by the political machinery around him. George worked punishing hours. He dictated memos at breakfast. He read dispatches at dinner. Mary's job was to make the rest of his life function so that he never had to think about it. She did not complain, not in public, and rarely in the notes she posted back to Washington. But the scale of what she had taken on was visible to anyone paying attention. Not yet 30 when she arrived, she was an ocean away from everyone she had grown up with, living inside a system designed by and for British men. The rules did not bend for her. She bent for them. The rules were about to get considerably more demanding. Chapter 7. The Dress. Long before she wore it, the gown had already crossed 3 countries. It began in a workshop in Delhi's Chandni Chowk district, where a man named Kishan Chand ran a team of professional embroiderers. Their craft was called zardozi, a Persian word meaning wire work. Using hooked needles, they stitched gold and silver thread through panels of champagne-coloured silk taffeta backed with Indian cotton muslin. The technique was centuries old, developed in the Mughal courts and refined across generations of artisans who worked by hand, stitch by stitch, under natural light. Each panel took weeks. The design was not left to chance. Mary had worked closely with House of Worth in Paris, the most sought-after couturier of the era, founded by Charles Frederick Worth and now run by his son, Jean-Philippe. The concept was specific. Cascading peacock feathers across the full length of the skirt, each plume rendered in metallic thread. At the center of every feather, where the eye would be, the embroiderers set an iridescent green beetle wing case. Hundreds of them. From a distance, they shimmered like gemstones. Guests who saw the finished garment up close were startled to discover that the emeralds they thought they were looking at were the shells of insects. The choice of motif was deliberate. In January 1903, George Curzon was staging the second Delhi Durbar, a 2-week imperial ceremony to mark the coronation of Edward VII as Emperor of India. The culminating event was a state ball held inside the Diwan-i-Khas at the Red Fort, the hall of private audience where Mughal emperors had once received their courts. That room had originally housed the peacock throne, a jewel-encrusted seat commissioned by Shah Jahan in the 17th century and looted during a Persian invasion in 1739. It had been gone for more than 160 years. Mary's dress put the peacock back in the room where it had once belonged. Whether this was homage or appropriation depends on who is telling the story. What is documented is that Mary understood the symbolism. She had spent years in India by this point, studying its textiles, visiting its ateliers, wearing locally made fabrics at a time when most British women in her position imported everything from Europe. Over time, she had become an advocate for Indian craftsmanship, and her patronage had made certain Delhi workshops fashionable among Western buyers who would never have considered Indian-made clothing before. The peacock dress was the most visible expression of this interest. It was also, unmistakably, a display of imperial authority, a British viceroy wearing Mughal symbols in a Mughal hall at a ceremony designed to demonstrate who now held power over the subcontinent. Once the panels were finished in Delhi, they were shipped to Paris. Jean-Philippe Worth assembled the fabric into a gown with a trained skirt and a fitted bodice trimmed with lace, rhinestones, and applied gold jewels. White silk roses lined the hem. When it was ready, it was sent back to India, arriving in time for the ball on the 6th of January. Mary knew what she was doing when she chose that dress for that room on that night. She had orchestrated the entire visual statement, from the Delhi embroiderers to the Parisian couturier, to the moment she stepped through the door. The Chicago Tribune ran her on the front page. The British and European press followed. George later commissioned a state portrait from the artist William Logsdale, but Mary did not live to sit for it. The painting was completed in 1909, 3 years after her death, working from photographs and the dress itself. The gown survived its owner by more than a century. It passed through the family until 1997, when Mary's youngest daughter Alexandra donated it to the British government in lieu of inheritance tax. Today it sits in a glass case at Kedleston Hall, carefully climate-controlled to prevent the metal threads from degrading. The beetle wings still catch the light. The National Trust calls it one of the most popular objects in the entire collection. Visitors stand in front of it and try to imagine what it looked like in motion, worn by a woman of commanding height walking through a candlelit hall in Delhi on a January evening more than 120 years ago. They are not the first people to find that image difficult to let go of. Chapter 8. Reforms. The ceremonies got the headlines. What Mary did between them did not. Shortly after arriving in India, she took on the chairmanship of an organization with a name that told its own story. The National Association for Supplying Medical Aid to the Women of India, commonly called the Dufferin Fund, had been established in the 1880s to address a problem that no amount of imperial pageantry could solve. Millions of Indian women lived behind purdah, the practice of physical seclusion from men outside the family. For these women, illness was not just a medical crisis, it was a social one. A male doctor could not examine them. In many regions, no female doctor existed. Women gave birth, fell sick, and sometimes died without ever seeing a trained practitioner. Mary did not approach this as charity. She approached it as logistics. The fund needed money, structure, and political backing, and she had access to all three. She reorganized its operations and expanded its fundraising base. Working directly with Colonel Ernest Fenn, the family surgeon who also served on the fund's committee, she identified where the gaps were widest. Hospital visits in cities and provinces across India convinced her that the system needed more than money. It needed women in medical schools. When Queen Victoria died in January 1901, Mary found an opportunity. She established a scholarship program in the late monarch's name, aimed at training female doctors and midwives to serve in communities where male practitioners were forbidden. Her fundraising campaign targeted Indian royalty directly, with personal appeals to princes and maharanis across the subcontinent. Within months, she had raised over £50,000. The scholarships funded more than 100 female medical professionals by the early 1900s. A wooden casket, acknowledging one of these efforts, presented to Mary in December 1900 when she opened the Lady Curzon Female Hospital in Bangalore, survives today in the museum at Kedleston Hall. Mary also recognized something that the formal hospital system could not address. Many women would not come to a hospital at all. The caste system and the practice of purdah kept them at home regardless of how sick they were. Rather than insisting that these women adapt to British medical infrastructure, Mary promoted a different model. Midwives working directly in the community, going to the women rather than waiting for the women to come to them. She secured Queen Victoria's personal endorsement for this approach before the monarch's death. It was practical, culturally sensitive, and ahead of its time. None of this appeared in the official dispatches that George sent to London. His correspondence focused on railways, tariffs, military organisation, and the endless chess match with the India office. Mary's work sat in a different register entirely. She operated in the spaces that imperial administration considered beneath notice, and she did so with a thoroughness that left measurable results behind. Her concern for India extended beyond its people. In the winter of 1904, Mary travelled to the Kaziranga region in Assam. She had heard about the great one-horned rhinoceros from friends who ran tea plantations in the area and wanted to see the animals for herself. A local tracker named Balaram Hazarika guided her through the grasslands. Hoofprints marked the mud. Flattened trails cut through the vegetation. But of the rhinoceros itself, there was no sign. Hazarika explained what Mary had already suspected. The animals were vanishing. Hunting and habitat loss had reduced their numbers to the point where sightings had become rare, even in areas where the species had once been common. Mary returned from the trip and asked George to act. He did. The Kaziranga proposed reserve forest was created, placing the area under government protection for the first time. It was later redesignated as a national park. Today, Kaziranga is home to roughly 2/3 of the world's remaining population of one-horned rhinoceroses. The park covers more than 400 square kilometres of floodplain and grassland along the Brahmaputra River. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The chain of events that led to its protection began with an American woman who crossed a swamp in Assam and came back frustrated that she had not seen what she went looking for. Mary's legacy in India was never going to be measured in speeches or state portraits. It was measured in hospital wards that opened because she raised the money, in women who survived childbirth because she insisted on training their midwives, and in a population of rhinoceroses that exists today because she refused to accept what she was told about their decline. The work cost her nothing that could be counted in currency. It cost her in energy, in time, and in the reserves of physical strength that India was steadily draining from her body. By the end of 1904, those reserves were nearly gone. Chapter 9. The Body Fails. George extended his term as Viceroy without asking his wife. The original appointment had been for 5 years, ending in 1904. Mary had expected to come home. She had been planning for it. Instead, George accepted a second term that would keep the family in India until 1905. He informed Mary after the decision was made. She did not protest publicly. She rarely did. But in January 1904, she left India without him, returning to England alone with their 2 daughters, while George remained in Calcutta. The official explanation was that she needed rest and better medical care for her next pregnancy. The private reality was simpler. Her body had been telling her something for months, and she had finally stopped ignoring it. Alexandra Naldera Curzon was born on the 20th of March, 1904. The family called her Baba, an Indian word for baby. She was healthy. She was also, once again, a girl. George received the news by telegram. Whatever he felt about a third daughter, his letters home focused on the practicalities of governing without his wife beside him. The months that followed broke everything open. In June, Levi Leiter died at Bar Harbor, Maine. He was 70. The man who had built the family fortune from a bookkeeper's salary, who had survived 2 Chicago fires and a son's catastrophic wheat speculation, who had funded his eldest daughter's entire married life, was gone. His estate was valued at roughly $15 million. Mary lost her father and her anchor in the same moment. Before she could grieve properly, her own body failed. That summer, she became pregnant again and miscarried within weeks. The miscarriage triggered an infection that spread rapidly and resisted treatment. Doctors could not identify the precise cause. Some suspected complications from the loss itself. Others pointed to poor plumbing at Walmer Castle in Kent, where the family had been staying. Whatever the origin, the infection brought Mary closer to death than anything she had faced before. By September, George had crossed back to England. He found his wife barely conscious, attended by specialists who offered little reassurance. He began making arrangements for her funeral. He listened to her instructions about the children. In her brief moments of clarity, she asked him not to take the girls back to India when she was gone. It was the one demand she made. Then, against every expectation, Mary recovered. The fever broke. Colour returned. She could sit up, then stand, then walk short distances with assistance. George wept when he realized she would survive. The relief was genuine. So was what he did next. Within weeks, he left her in England and returned to India. The Viceroyalty had to continue. What Mary did in response still startles anyone who reads the account. She followed him. Barely recovered, visibly weakened, warned by her doctors that the journey could kill her, she boarded a ship and sailed back to India. A letter to George preceded her departure, telling him she would join him shortly. There were no complaints, no recriminations. She simply refused once more to let him face his responsibilities alone. Arriving back in India, the family was met by disaster. Shortly after Mary arrived, an earthquake struck the region, reportedly killing 1,500 people in the surrounding towns and damaging the buildings where they lived. It was as though the country itself was warning them that this second term would end differently from the first. Mary felt stronger in the warmer climate. She resumed some of her duties, attended selected events, and maintained a presence in official correspondence. But those who saw her in person noticed the difference. The woman who had silenced a room at the Delhi Durbar 2 years earlier now moved carefully, conserved her energy, and left gatherings early. The reserves she had rebuilt in England were shallow, and the climate was wearing through them. She was 34 years old. She had given birth 3 times in 8 years, survived a near-fatal infection, lost her father, and followed a husband back to a continent that was taking her apart. She did not know it yet, but she had less than 2 years left. Chapter 10. The Fall. The man who destroyed George Curzon's career in India was someone George himself had chosen. Lord Kitchener arrived as Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army in 1902, appointed at George's personal request. The logic had seemed sound. Kitchener was the most celebrated military figure in the British Empire, the hero of Khartoum, a man whose reputation could only enhance the prestige of the Viceroyalty. George believed that having such a figure on his staff would reflect well on his own administration. Friends in London warned him otherwise. Kitchener, one of them cautioned, was an uncouth and ruthless man. George did not listen. The dispute that followed began as a bureaucratic disagreement and ended as a power struggle that reached the highest levels of government. At its centre was a question of control. The Viceroy's Executive Council included a military member who oversaw army supply and logistics independently of the Commander-in-Chief. Kitchener wanted that role eliminated and its authority folded into his own command. The Viceroy refused. He saw the military member as a necessary check on military power, a civilian brake on a system that could otherwise operate beyond political oversight. Both men were proud, stubborn, and convinced of their own infallibility. Their correspondence grew bitter. George once scrawled on an official document that he was filled with a sense of the ineptitude of his military advisers. Kitchener, meanwhile, lobbied London directly, going over the Viceroy's head with letters to cabinet ministers and allies in Parliament. The dispute consumed months. It devoured George's attention, his relationships, and whatever goodwill he had left in Westminster. Mary watched all of this from the margins. She had spent 6 years supporting her husband's position in India, hosting his allies, managing his household, and absorbing the physical cost of a role that had nearly killed her. Now she watched that position disintegrate in a fight over military bureaucracy. The letters she received from George during this period were dominated by the crisis. Kitchener's manoeuvres, the cabinet's wavering, the growing sense that London was preparing to abandon him. In the summer of 1905, the government made its decision. Prime Minister Arthur Balfour sided with Kitchener. George, who had framed the dispute as an ultimatum, was left with no room to retreat. On the 16th of August, a telegram arrived from King Edward VII. It informed George that his resignation had been accepted. There was no expression of regret. There was no offer of an earldom, the honour customarily awarded to departing viceroys. George Curzon, who had governed India for nearly 7 years, was sent home with nothing. The humiliation cut deep. George had staked his reputation on a confrontation he was certain he would win, and the people he trusted most in London had chosen his opponent. Winston Churchill, who had his own grievances with Kitchener, defended George in the House of Commons, calling out the contemptuous manner in which the Viceroy had been driven from the country. It was a rare moment of sympathy for a man who had made sympathy difficult to earn. Mary did not share her husband's devastation. What she felt, as far as anyone close to her could tell, was relief. The appointment that had taken her health, her proximity to her family, and the better part of a decade was finally over. She began planning. 3 months in the south of France. Rest, time with the girls. A life that did not revolve around protocol and precedents. On the 18th of November, 1905, the Curzon family boarded a ship in Bombay and sailed for England. Her husband stood at the rail and watched India disappear behind them. Mary, one imagines, did not look back. She had given India everything it asked of her. India had given her back a body that no longer worked the way it once had. The south of France awaited. After that, she believed, there would be time to recover. There would not. Chapter 11, July 18th, 1906. The south of France did not save her. The family spent the winter and early spring on the Mediterranean coast, exactly as Mary had planned. The girls played in the sun. George brooded over his political future. Mary rested, walked when she could, and wrote letters to friends and family that said the right things about recovery without ever quite convincing anyone. By the time they returned to London in the spring of 1906, she looked no better than when they had left India. Carlton House Terrace, the house her father had bought. The first address in the row, marble pillars, the park below. It should have felt like a homecoming. Instead, it became the place where Mary's world contracted to a set of rooms, a handful of visitors, and a body that gave back less with each passing week. The summer arrived early that year and settled over London with a weight that did not lift. Mary's condition, which her doctors described in cautious terms as general debility, worsened in the heat. She tired easily. She ate little. She spent more time in bed than out of it. George was present, more present than he had been in years, though whether this was devotion or the simple fact that he had nowhere else to go is difficult to separate. His political career was stalled. His diary was empty. For the first time in their marriage, Mary had his full attention. It came too late to matter. On the morning of the 18th of July, Mary woke after a restless night. The day was warm. Nothing in the early hours suggested that this day would be different from the ones that preceded it. She was tired, as she always was now, but alert enough to speak with the household staff and acknowledge the people around her. At noon, something changed. Her breathing grew labored, her color drained. The household sent for help. 2 specialists arrived and remained at her side through the afternoon. They could stabilize nothing. The debility that had been pulling her down for months had found its floor, and the floor gave way. At approximately 20 minutes to 6 in the evening, Mary Victoria Curzon, Baroness Curzon of Kedleston, died of heart failure. She was 36 years old. Her husband was in the room. George did not leave her side for some time afterward. The household issued a statement confirming the cause of death. The funeral, it was announced, would take place at Kedleston. Telegrams went out to Washington, to the Leiter family, to friends and officials across 2 continents. The newspapers ran the story the following morning. The Chicago Tribune, which had put her on its front page 3 years earlier in a gown of gold, now carried her obituary. The paper noted something that Mary herself might have appreciated. It said she had lacked the aggressive self-confidence usually attributed to ambitious American girls. Instead, she had attracted people through reserve, a thoughtful manner, and what the reporter called an engaging sympathy. She left behind 3 daughters. Irene was 10, Cynthia was 7, Baba was 2. They would grow up without their mother in a country their mother had crossed an ocean to reach. George, who had once written that he wanted a girl who knew her place, was now alone with 3 of them. He had lost the woman who had chosen him before he chose her, who had waited 5 years for a wedding he kept postponing, who had followed him to India and back again, when her doctors told her the journey could kill her. He had lost the person who made his life function, the machinery she had built around him, the households, the social networks, the diplomatic warmth that opened doors his personality closed. All of it stopped on a July afternoon in London. He would spend the rest of his life trying to describe what that loss meant. He never quite managed it.